this is my hood, man. Like, I get love from my hood. Like, I'm not afraid of anywhere I go.
For at least a century, Harlem has been almost synonymous with Black American culture. Businesses and services there have been predominantly owned by Black residents and catered to the predominantly Black residents. Walking down the street, one can still hear rap to reggae blasting in the street from Black hair salons, street vendors, and restaurants. Located in northern Manhattan, Harlem has been considered a center of cultural and historical importance for Black American culture since the Great Migration of the early 20th century. But in recent years, there have been more discussions regarding Harlem of today versus the Harlem of back then. What's changed? Why are more buildings of historical importance being knocked down and more places up for lease? Why are things more expensive? All of these questions can be answered with one word: gentrification. Lawrence Fishburne gives a great, quick explanation of gentrification in the 1992 classic movie, Boys in the Hood.
Why don't y'all take a look at that sign up there? See what it says? Cash for your home? You know what that is?
Billboard.
What are y'all, Amos and Andy? Are you stepping and he's fetching? I'm talking about the message, what it stands for. It's called gentrification. It's what happens when the property value of a certain area is brought down. Huh? You listening?
Yeah.
To bring the property value down. They can buy the land at a lower price. Then they move all the people out, raise the property value, and sell it at a profit. Now what we need to do is we need to keep everything in our neighborhood, everything, Black. Black owned with Black money.
Now, how has gentrification played a role in making what Harlem is today? Let's look at the history of Harlem and tell you how we got here. To truly understand how upsetting the gentrification of Harlem is, we must look back at Harlem's beginnings as the Black cultural capital it would become. This all starts with the Great Migration. This was the movement of 6 million Black Americans from moving out of the rural South and up north. As Black people migrated north, they brought jazz from the South to Harlem, where it would evolve and be refined into the big band style as played and sung by Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and Billie Holiday. This period of music and poetry flourishing would come to be known as the Harlem Renaissance. The art produced during this time is one of the lasting associations made with Harlem. In a sort of opposite image of today's gentrification, middle-class white people started moving out of Harlem as Black people came north. As protesting and rioting did not help stop Black people moving into Harlem, the population of Black people there increased drastically. After the 1920s, housing investment decreased in the Great Depression, and for several decades, Harlem was left untouched, developing into the ghetto that most people associated with as that is also how it was depicted in headlines. After the Great Depression came, the expanded subway, which meant Black leaders were able to easily get to and from Harlem. Black churches, shops built by followers of Marcus Garvey, and theaters were all constructed in Harlem and patronized mostly by the Black residents and white people who lived in other neighborhoods. This prosperity would have an end. In the decades to come, Harlem would see a decay, making it more susceptible to attacks from upper-class whites looking to make a profit. Those who remained were the poorest and least skilled with the fewest opportunities for success. Harlem had several owners default on taxes and abandon their buildings, which led to New York City to replace those landlords for 70% of the properties in Harlem. At this point and onwards, buildings had been abandoned even after the government of New York City became the new landlords. As far as landlords go, the municipal government was extremely negligent. These now publicly owned buildings were used as disreputable places where, for example, drug deals and other criminal activities occurred. If not being used by criminals, the buildings were just left abandoned. When the government failed to restore Harlem, several groups of Harlem residents sought to succeed. One notable group was formed by 7 low-income families called the United Harlem Growth. These families inhabited public housing, abandoned buildings, or apartments that were out of rent control. They bought 5 city-owned houses with plans to renovate them into low-income cooperative housing. Unfortunately, some old residents of Harlem have actually helped with Harlem becoming more gentrified as they have founded organizations that express the need to clean up Harlem. Abyssinian Development Corporation, or ADC, was an organization in the 1980s that provided social services and encouraged economic development not for the low-income residents, but rather the new middle class. With the Reagan administration cutting off federal involvement in American cities, people relied on local, state, private, and nonprofit sources. There were many different housing-related projects, be it for low-income families or senior citizens. People wanted different types of development done, so there was a lot of economic integration due to the different projects. Economic integration tends to happen when there's a big push for development for the sake of having development. Despite what was meant to be progress, economic development of this sort always comes at a steep price. Gentrification. More buildings are being built on historic locations and landmarks on 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, the iconic entryway and main streets of Harlem. The rent is increasing and historic buildings are being demolished. The Renaissance, where Duke Ellington played, and the Child's Memorial Temple Church of God in Christ, where Malcolm X's funeral was held, have both been torn down. Legendary clubs immortalized in memoirs like Smalls, Paradise, and Lenox Lounge are also gone. Even more upsetting than the demolition of historic landmarks is the forced removal of residents from their homes. For some residents, harassment and housing displacement is due to the lack of protection from policies created by the Division of Housing and Community Renewal, or DHCR. The state-managed program provides middle-income residents with affordable apartments and allows low-interest loans and tax breaks for developers. The downside is that this gives the landlords the freedom to choose what is paid at the end of a 20-year period to pay the leftover mortgage and not pay subsidies, which places apartments at market rate. Most longtime residents in Harlem are against turning the historical and culturally important streets and landmarks into extensions of Manhattan's Upper East Side, says Neil Shoemaker, director of Harlem Heritage Tours. Department of City Planning claims outreach is critical and held a series of meetings with advisory committee and community members. Harlem began to see rapid gentrification in the late 1990s. This was driven by changing federal and city policies, including fierce crime fighting and a concerted effort to develop the retail corridor on 125th Street. The number of housing units in Harlem increased by 14% between 1990 and 2000, and the rate of increase has been much more rapid in recent years. Property values in central Harlem increased nearly 300% during the 1990s, while the rest of New York City saw only a 12% increase. From 2000 to 2005, 32,500 black residents were kicked out, while 28,000 white people moved into Harlem, and many argue that this led to the increase of property value. New lofts and rebranded brownstones can cost anywhere between $1.5 and $4 million. Old apartments charge monthly rent from $500 to $800, but new apartments can be up to $4,000 per month. Ironically, even the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture had been another victim of gentrification itself, as a worker told me as I was doing research. He goes on to talk to me about his life in the city. The building was a residential space that later got demolished and made into the center. Even though this was a victim, the place was aware of its history and will not let others forget it.
Yeah, but they moved out a lot of the street vendors along 125th, and they were forced down in this area down by 116th and Lenox. They gradually made their way back, though. But in the process, a bunch of franchise businesses and stuff started moving in along 125th. And fairly common things that are, eating establishments and clothing establishments that you find pretty much in any other urban area. And then there's some nice things like the Magic Johnson Theater, which is a nice thing. But here it's like becoming expensive, so I decided to move here. I should have done it back in the 90s.
Real estate prices have increased dramatically over the last 15 years in New York City, to the point that some areas topped a new list of the country's most gentrified zip codes. Northeast Harlem placed at number 5 and saw property values increase by 356%. And just under 2 years ago, a Whole Foods opened on 125th Street and Lenox Avenue. Central Harlem is still black as far as the 2010 census, but it is very possible that that will change near 2020. There are still Central Harlem residents that celebrated the first popular supermarket in Harlem in the 1990s. Now that supermarket is being sold to major developers by the Abyssinian Development Corporation. It will become harder for old residents to stay and easier for upper-class white people to move in. I'll leave you with a quote from Valerie Jo Bradley, the founder of the preservation advocacy group Save Harlem Now. Everywhere I travel in the U.S. and even in Brixton and London, a place as culturally vibrant as Harlem, wherever people of color live, we and the landmarks that embody our presence, unprotected, piece by piece, are being replaced. End quote. This is precisely why gentrification is a problem. Because where do originals go after replacements arrive?
Drink it daily just to sell my third. Yeah. Now we can skip the side B. Just make it quick when you gentrify me. Okay. Yeah. Now we can skip the side B. Okay. Yeah. Just make it quick when you gentrify me.